Sean Ryan on the show a couple months ago. He was amazing, former Navy SEAL. And he tweeted out this picture of himself with the combat paint on his face. And the caption is, "This is a photo of me not being Tim Walz. Some of us answered the call, and some of us, Tim Walz, cowered in the rear." Then there's Sean Parnell, who had run for Senate in Pennsylvania a couple years ago. Same picture of himself with his guns. "This is a photo of me not being."
This started like a normal political clip, and then absolutely did not stay normal. Somewhere between confidence and confusion, things took a hard left into chaos. Words flew, logic snapped, and the internet collectively leaned closer to their screens. No shouting, no theatrics, just a calm verbal sledgehammer that left everyone blinking. How did this escalate so fast? And why is everyone replaying the same 5 seconds? Let's talk about it.
Trump and J.D. Vance have a manual too. It's called Project 2025, and it's a way to stick it to the middle class while giving tax cuts to the wealthiest. Look, they didn't give me a manual for this if you didn't plan on using it to fix your truck. They didn't create that Project 2025 just to have it set around as a doorstop.
According to the LA Times, this kind of car sells for anywhere between $39,000 to $59,000. So he's just a regular working class guy with a $60,000 automobile. He's just like you.
The internet has a special way of reminding certain politicians that confidence is not the same thing as competence. And Tim Walz learned that lesson the hard way when Megyn Kelly turned his carefully curated public image into a highlight reel of unintended comedy.
Just simple on this. You commit fraud in Minnesota, you're going to prison. I don't care what color you are, what religion you are. Anybody who wants to help us in that, we welcome that. But sitting on the sidelines and throwing out accusations, and let's be very clear, demonizing an entire population and lying to people about the safety and security of this state is beneath that.
And meanwhile, state Senate Republicans say the fraud in Minnesota...
What made the situation so entertaining was not outrage or volume, but the sheer imbalance of preparation, because while one side showed up armed with clarity and structure, the other arrived wearing the unmistakable glow of someone who assumed vibes would do most of the heavy lifting.
What is the truth about Minnesota governor and now Democratic vice presidential pick, Tim Walz, and his military service record? Questions have been swirling, including allegations that Mr. Walz abandoned his fellow troops in their greatest time of need. Even claims of stolen valor. Yesterday on this program, I spoke with a Minnesota National Guard veteran who has been sounding the alarm on this story for years.
It may surprise you to know that Tim Walz has long mastered the art of sounding reassuring without actually saying anything that requires commitment, which usually works beautifully in friendly environments where nodding is mistaken for scrutiny.
Me not being Tim Walz. These guys get it, and they are not going to be spun by Morning Joe saying, "Oh, there's nothing to this. This is like." You tell it to these brave guys who put on their uniforms, grabbed their guns, and actually risked their lives and saw their buddies die in the theater that he quit on as his unit went off.
Unfortunately for him, this time, the narrative wandered into Megyn Kelly's orbit, where comforting ambiguity goes to get audited. The result was not a clash, but a systematic dismantling that felt less like an argument and more like watching someone explain themselves into a corner they clearly forgot existed. Megyn Kelly did not need to raise her voice or resort to theatrics because the material presented itself generously. Tim Walz's statements carried the confidence of someone accustomed to applause breaks, yet they collapsed under even minimal examination, which is always a risky combination when your entire presentation depends on not being interrupted by reality. Every position he leaned on seemed sturdy until it was asked to support its own weight, at which point it began creaking like an overconfident folding chair.
Allegations. For what it's worth, the Harris-Walz campaign and the complicit media would have you believe this entire controversy is just a bunch of nonsense. But today we're going to bring you the receipts. Here's what we know. Days after the September 11th, 2001 attack on our nation, Mr. Walz re-enlisted in the National Guard for a 6-year commitment. He would later claim it was only 4. Alpha News, they're in Minnesota, they've obtained the paperwork. It was 6. So I don't know why he's misleading about that, but he signed up to stay in until 2007. 2007, not 2000.
The comedic value skyrocketed as it became increasingly clear that Tim Walz's strategy relied heavily on expectation rather than substance. He seemed to operate under the assumption that repetition could substitute for explanation, which is a bold move unless your audience has agreed in advance to stop thinking. Megyn Kelly, however, has never been known for participating in collective intellectual naps, and she treated every vague claim like a loose thread that absolutely needed pulling. What followed was not a dramatic confrontation, but a slow, merciless unraveling that felt almost surgical in its precision. Megyn Kelly exposed contradictions simply by allowing them to exist in the open, which is often the most efficient way to let weak logic self-destruct. Tim Walz's ideas did not fail because they were attacked aggressively, but because they were asked to behave consistently, which turned out to be a far more demanding requirement. The humor of the moment came from watching confidence attempt to outrun preparation and fail repeatedly. Tim Walz's explanations expanded in length but shrank in clarity, producing that familiar political phenomenon where more words somehow result in less meaning. It was like watching someone try to solve a math problem by adding extra numbers until the answer felt emotionally satisfying, even if it no longer resembled reality.
For Tim Walz on the disastrous performance he delivered, in particular when it comes to his self-described knuckle-headed behavior, which was just his latest in a series of lies. The reason he resorted to, I'm a knucklehead, was he got confronted with his latest lie that's been unearthed. There's a long list of them. This one was that he was in China when the Tiananmen Square disaster unfolded.
The fact stands that Megyn Kelly's role in this spectacle was almost unfair because she did not need to exaggerate or embellish anything. She simply allowed the structure of Tim Walz's reasoning to present itself honestly, and honesty, in this case, did most of the damage. The contrast between composure and confusion grew sharper with every passing moment, turning what could have been a forgettable appearance into a viral example of how not to overestimate your intellectual footing. Tim Walz appeared determined to maintain authority through tone alone, which is a strategy that works best when no one checks the math. Unfortunately for him, Megyn Kelly's entire approach revolved around checking the math, rechecking it, and then asking why the calculator was suddenly sweating. The resulting imbalance made it painfully obvious that one side had prepared for questions while the other had prepared for agreement. The spectacle became even more entertaining once Tim Walz's confidence began to visibly struggle against the weight of its own assumptions. His statements relied heavily on implied conclusions, yet those implications fell apart the moment they were treated as actual positions instead of rhetorical decorations. Megyn Kelly did not need to accuse him of inconsistency because she simply allowed the inconsistencies to line up neatly on their own.
In late 2003, he deployed with his unit to Italy in support of Operation Enduring Freedom. Operation Enduring Freedom is also known as the war in Afghanistan. He never went to Afghanistan. He never saw active combat, nor was he part of Enduring Freedom. Again, that name is used for the war in Afghanistan. He was in a support role in Italy. In the military, these words matter.
At this point, the situation transitioned from political commentary into unintentional satire. Tim Walz's attempts to clarify only served to highlight how little clarity existed in the first place, creating a loop where every explanation demanded another explanation just to remain upright. Watching this unfold felt like observing someone insist they have a plan while actively Googling what a plan is supposed to look like. Megyn Kelly's restraint amplified the humiliation because she never appeared rushed or rattled. She did not pile on or gloat, which somehow made the contrast even harsher. Tim Walz's certainty slowly eroded into defensiveness, and defensiveness is rarely convincing when it arrives wearing the costume of confidence. The internet immediately recognized the imbalance and responded accordingly, because nothing travels faster online than a moment where authority collapses under its own weight. Clips circulated not because of shouting or spectacle, but because viewers could not resist watching the precise moment where confidence realized it had been oversold. The reactions were less about outrage and more about disbelief, as people collectively processed how avoidable the entire situation had been. What made the takedown especially effective was its efficiency. Megyn Kelly did not wander or digress. and she did not allow the conversation to escape into abstract generalities. Every point returned to coherence, and every attempt to pivot was gently redirected back to substance. Tim Walz, meanwhile, appeared increasingly trapped by his own framing, unable to retreat without contradicting himself and unable to advance without exposing new weaknesses.
You know whether you were in a place where hundreds of people are being massacred by their government when it happens. But he continues to try to say, like, oh, gee, I was just kind of confused. You know, that happened in May and I was there in August, but I guess I just imagined that I was there, whatever. So he got asked about that debate moment where he completely melted down on Wednesday in Pennsylvania, and here's how he handled it.
Look, I have my dates wrong. I was in Hong Kong and China in 1989.
The humor peaked when it became obvious that Tim Walz believed he was still performing well. This misplaced confidence persisted even as the structural integrity of his arguments collapsed in plain view, which added a layer of dramatic irony that no writer could have planned better. Megyn Kelly did not need to correct him because the contrast between perception and reality was doing enough work on its own. By the later stages, the outcome was no longer in doubt, and the remaining moments functioned as confirmation rather than suspense. Tim Walz's narrative had been thoroughly stress-tested and found wanting, while Megyn Kelly's approach emerged looking sharper precisely because it never relied on theatrics. The entire episode felt like a masterclass in how to dismantle a position without ever appearing hostile. The aftermath followed the usual pattern, with commentators dissecting the moment and audiences replaying it for both insight and entertainment. Tim Walz's performance became a reference point, not because it was uniquely terrible, but because it was so emblematic of what happens when preparation is replaced with assumption. Megyn Kelly's role solidified as the calm constant in the chaos, the person who did not need to dominate the conversation because she understood how to let weak ideas defeat themselves.
You've got Tim Walz. Okay, Jen Psaki, she's a talking head, whatever. But Tim Walz was recently the vice presidential candidate on the Democratic ticket. Maybe you'd expect a little better, a little higher in terms of the rhetoric. You would be disappointed. Here is SOT 27.
You get up in the morning and you doom scroll through things, and although I will say this, the last few days you woke up thinking there might be news. Just saying.
In the end, the roast landed so effectively because it never felt forced. The humor emerged naturally from the contrast between confidence and competence, and the takedown succeeded because it respected the audience's intelligence. Megyn Kelly did not shout or posture, and Tim Walz did not implode dramatically, yet the result was unmistakable. This was not a shouting match or a clash of personalities, but a one-sided demonstration of what happens when polished rhetoric meets structured scrutiny. Tim Walz walked in expecting familiarity to carry him through, and Megyn Kelly ensured that familiarity was replaced with accountability. The internet laughed not because it was cruel, but because the irony was too precise to ignore. By the time the dust settled, the lesson was clear and unmissable. Confidence is not armor, repetition is not evidence, and charm does not survive contact with preparation. Megyn Kelly walked away without raising her voice, while Tim Walz left behind a cautionary example that will likely be replayed far longer than he anticipated. What made the situation even more brutal was how effortlessly the imbalance sustained itself, because there was never a moment where Tim Walz managed to regain narrative control or even slow the momentum of his own unraveling. His public persona, usually padded by friendly interpretations and generous framing, suddenly had to stand on its own without the safety net of selective listening. When that net disappeared, the performance revealed just how dependent it had been on an audience willing to fill in the gaps on his behalf.
Send Tim Walz out there to be sort of man of the people. And the latest effort was him this weekend, like working on his car. He's just like a guy who works on the car and kicks the engine around.
Everything works on here, except one thing I'm still tinkering with, cruise control. So I'm going to show you how to fix that. At the same time, we talk about creating an opportunity economy so that everybody can get the opportunity to thrive. To be able to work on this thing, you got a manual. It shows you exactly what to do to fix things on this.
Here's the shocker. Megyn Kelly's effectiveness came from understanding that overexposure is often the most reliable way to neutralize overconfidence. She allowed Tim Walz's ideas to stretch out fully, knowing that the longer they were allowed to exist in open air, the harder it would be to ignore their inconsistencies. This approach turned the entire situation into a slow burn roast where the punchline revealed itself organically, rather than being delivered with forced emphasis. The longer Tim Walz attempted to defend his positions, the more he resembled someone trying to outrun a shadow while insisting it was not following him. Each attempt to reinforce credibility only highlighted how much of it relied on implication rather than structure. The explanations became increasingly abstract, drifting away from accountability and toward rhetorical fog, which never plays well when clarity is the standard being applied. Megyn Kelly's restraint continued to sharpen the contrast because she never appeared invested in winning a spectacle. Instead, she focused on coherence, which turned out to be the most unforgiving metric imaginable. Tim Walz's messaging, once removed from its usual echo chamber, struggled to survive contact with basic scrutiny, and the struggle was visible enough to become uncomfortable.
Be news sometime, just so you know, there will be news.
Look at him. So chipper. Don't worry, there will be news. In other words, Trump will die. Something to look forward to. The absolute nerve, especially with a president who was subjected to at least 2 assassination attempts and just dodged death in recent history, to the great relief of every sane person in the nation. Now to be openly, talking about what a delicious day it's going to be.
The roast element deepened as the audience began to recognize how much of Tim Walz's authority depended on the assumption that no one would slow the conversation down long enough to notice the cracks. Megyn Kelly slowed it down deliberately, not to embarrass him, but to examine the claims as they were presented. That examination stripped away the performative polish and left behind a framework that simply could not support itself. There was a particularly sharp irony in watching Tim Walz attempt to project steadiness while clearly recalibrating in real time. The recalibration did not signal adaptability, but rather exposed how little contingency planning had been done for genuine challenge. Megyn Kelly did not corner him aggressively, yet he still managed to corner himself through over-explanation and contradiction. As the commentary spread online, the moment took on symbolic weight, representing a broader frustration with rhetoric that relies on tone over substance. Viewers did not latch onto it because they disliked Tim Walz personally, but because the dynamic felt familiar. It was the universal experience of watching confidence evaporate when it is asked to justify itself without applause acting as insulation. By the end of it all, the takeaway was unavoidable. Megyn Kelly demonstrated that intellectual pressure does not need volume to be effective, and Tim Walz demonstrated that certainty without preparation is a liability, not a strength. The roast worked because it was never announced, never exaggerated, and never forced. It simply unfolded, letting contrast do the work and letting irony deliver the final blow with surgical precision.